All right, in this video, we're going to be building an AppSync API using CDK, and the data source that we're going to be using today is going to be serverless Aurora using Postgres. Now, we're also going to be mapping these output values that CDK creates into a file for consumption on the front end in a Next.js app using Amplify. Most of my videos in the past have been using a NoSQL database like DynamoDB, but really with AppSync, you have the flexibility of not really being limited to any data source. And with CDK and using a Lambda function as the data source, we can actually map our GraphQL operations to multiple data sources. So why not use something else? So in this example, we're going to be kind of showing how to do that. I'll be live coding everything from scratch. We're going to start off with a new Next.js project. We're going to then initialize a new CDK project within that next project. We're going to create a AppSync API, add our GraphQL schema. We're going to then create a Amazon Aurora data source, a Lambda data source. We're going to create the GraphQL operations that are going to map from Lambda into the Aurora database. And we're going to kind of, walk through everything from scratch. So this is going to be a really interesting video. I hope you learned something from it. And be sure to subscribe to my channel if you're not already. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a new Next app using npx. And we'll call this maybe RDS for Relational Database Service, Next.js, CDK. So we'll just add all of those keywords there into the name. And while that's creating, I will go ahead and change into that new directory. And what I'd like to do is make a new directory called something like CDK Backend. So I'll change into that new directory. And here we'll initialize our CDK project. So what I'll do is I'll do CDK init, and then I'll say language is equal to TypeScript. And this is where we're going to be doing most of the work. We're going to create our backend, and then once our backend is created and deployed, we'll then jump back into our Next.js app and connect to it. Once our CDK project is created, we'll go ahead and install the dependencies that we're going to need. So we're going to need AppSync, we're going to need Lambda, we're going to need EC2, and we're going to need RDS for our constructs and classes. And these are going to be, I need to do yarn add. And these are going to basically be all of the different constructs and classes that we're going to need to create our infrastructure. So AppSync for the API, we're going to need to create a VPC for our RDS service to work. So that's literally done in just a single line of code. So we'll do that. So after we've installed our dependencies, we can go ahead and open this up. And I'll open this thing up in VS Code, and we'll start writing some code. So what we're going to do is in our project, let me go ahead and restart VS Code. Looks like my stuff isn't showing up there. In our project, we're going to have this CDK project that's created for us. And we're going to be working within this lib/CDK backend stack. This is kind of our main stack that we're going to be working in. And here you can kind of see there's a comment that says the code that defines your stack goes here. This is where we're going to be writing our code. We're also going to be creating a couple folders within the CDK project for our GraphQL schema and also for our Lambda function. So what else do we need? We need AppSync. So we'll do something like this. We'll also need Lambda. We're going to need RDS. So we'll do And then finally, we're just going to need EC2. I have a hard time typing that star. Okay, so we have all the constructs and classes that we're going to need. So the first thing is what we're going to do is go ahead and create an API. And we'll call this .graphql API. And here what we need to pass in is the scope, which is this, the name for our API locally, which is going to be just something like that, and then all of the different props. So we're going to give the API a name, and we'll call this AppSync blog backend for something like a blog. We'll set the schema location, and what we're going to basically need to do is set the file path for our GraphQL schema. So I'm going to say appsync.schema.fromAsset, and we're going to say it's going to be in this GraphQL folder, and then it's going to be in a file called schema.graphql. And then finally, we can pass in our authorization configuration for our default authorization config. And this is going to basically set our default. Now, you can have multiple authorization configurations. You typically have like a default and then additional. So you might have like a public API and then an authorized API for fine-grained access control and stuff like that. For a public API, you're going to be typically using API key, and that's what we're using here. And what we're basically doing here is we're setting our expiration date. By default, it will give you a default expiration, but we want to kind of have control over that. So I'm basically saying I want this API key to last 1 year by setting the default to 365 days. So what we can do now is go ahead and create a folder called GraphQL. And here we're going to create a file called schema.graphql. Now what we're basically going to be needing to do is create a backend for a blog. So I have a GraphQL schema that we're going to basically be using. That's going to basically be all structured off of this post type. The post has an ID, a title, and a content field. Now, the ID, the title, and the content field are all required fields. So that's why we kind of have this exclamation point. But we also have input types for creating and updating a post. For creating a post, we're going to leave the ID as optional or as nullable, because what we're going to basically be doing in our Lambda function is we're going to detect whether or not the user has passed in an ID, and if they have, we'll use it, and if they haven't, we'll automatically generate one on the server. For updating a post, we need to make sure that the user has passed in at least the post ID, because that way we can determine which post to update. The title and the content will then be optional. We'll then have two operations for queries. We're going to have a list post query that's going to return an array of posts. And then we have a get post by ID query that takes in a post ID and returns a post. So those are our two queries. And then for our mutations, we have three. We have a mutation for creating a post, one for deleting a post, and one for updating a post. The create and update take a input type, and then the delete only takes in a string, because all we really need to delete a post is the post ID. We then create three subscriptions for on create, on update, and on delete. So we create all that. We can go ahead and save that. What we can now do is we can actually go back to our CLI, and we can go ahead and run a build, because we actually have a project that can be deployed if we would like it to be. So we could say something like in CDK diff, and this will kind of give us an idea about what would be deployed if we ran a build or if we ran a deployment right now. So here you see that we have the resource creation of a GraphQL API, and then we have the GraphQL schema and the API key. So we're not ready to deploy just yet. We're going to continue building out our API, because all we have is the API itself. We don't really have any data sources or anything like that. So what we're going to now do is create a VPC. And we'll just go ahead and call new ec2.vpc. And here we can pass in the scope and then a name. So I'll call this blog app VPC. And this is kind of going to be our VPC that we're going to end up using for our Aurora cluster. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and create our Aurora cluster. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and use these lines of code here. We're basically saying we have a new RDS.serverless cluster. We're passing in the scope. We're passing in a name. We're passing in the engine, which is basically specifying that we want Postgres. You could also use MySQL here. We're specifying the version here in the parameter group. We're setting a default database name. And then we are then defining the VPC. And you can actually hover over each class or each construct or each, anything that's imported from the CDK and see an idea of the API. So you see that we have the scope, the ID, and the props. So in this example, the scope is this, the ID is this, and then these are the props. So anytime that you're kind of building, you kind of get an idea of like what can be passed in. So now that we have that, what we need to do is create our Lambda function. And the Lambda function is basically going to be utilizing some of the cluster resource variables and things like that. So for the function, it's going to start right here. So we're going to go ahead and create a new Lambda function. We're giving it a scope of this, the ID of my function. We're setting the runtime as Node.js 10.x or greater, or 10.x. We're defining where the code is going to come from. In this example, we're going to create a folder called Lambda FNS, and then all of our Lambda function code is going to be there. And then the handler is going to be index.handler. So we're going to have Lambda functions folder or Lambda FNS /index. And in that index.js, we're going to have a handler. We're defining the memory size. I usually like to bump my memory size up to at least 1024. This way it runs a little faster and it doesn't typically cost any extra because it runs so much faster. Your build for typically around the same amount. We're also defining some environment variables. Now within our function, we're going to need to have access to our cluster ARN, our secret ARN, as well as our database name for us to interact with the database. Now, we don't want to hard code that in there. So by doing this, we can then use process.env.clusterARN, process.env.secretARN, and so on and so forth. We're also granting the access from our function to the cluster. So we're basically setting some IAM access here. And then finally, we're defining our data source here. We're basically saying we want our API to have the data source of Lambda data source. So we have a lot of stuff going on there. The next thing that we need to do now is we want to go ahead and create our resolvers. So to do that, we can just now use our Lambda data source, because we've defined our Lambda data source here, defining the data source as Lambda DS, and then we're using the post function that we created right here. So what we can do now is create a couple of resolvers, or a handful of resolvers. And in our GraphQL schema, we had 2 queries and 3 mutations. So here we're also defining resolvers for those 2 queries and those 3 mutations here. So we're creating a resolver for list posts, get posts by ID, create posts, update posts, and delete posts. And to do that, all we're basically saying is lambda data source.create resolver, defining the type name and the field name. And now anytime you define one of these resolvers from this lambda data source, this operation is going to be mapped to that lambda function. And in the event that's passed in, you'll have any of the event information from that operation. So if you pass in any arguments, they will be there. If there is a signed in user, that user information would be there. You're going to have all of the info object information, like the query property itself, as well as the field name here. So all that stuff is going to be there. Now, the last thing we need to do is we want to create some output for us to be able to consume this API within a client-side application, in our case, Next.js. So to do that, you have to have this amplify.configure if you're using Amplify, which is what we're going to be doing to be able to access these resource values. So for instance, our API key, our GraphQL endpoint, and things like that. Now, what we can do is we can either go into the console itself and find that stuff, or we can use this cdk.cfn output to print that information out to our console, but also we can pipe that into a file that we can then consume in our client app. So we're going to do that. So we're basically saying we want to print out the AppSync API URL, the AppSync API key in the project region. We're given these names here, so this could be whatever string we would like. The value itself is coming from here. So for the value here, we're saying we want the API.GraphQL URL, the API.API key, and then we want the region for this project. So that's all we need to do. We should be able to go ahead and save that. And what we can now do is go ahead and run a diff and see the difference here. So I'm going to go ahead and open up terminal. And here we can say npm run build, and we can run CDK diff. Now, I think the only thing we need to do at this point is to go ahead and create our Lambda functions. So we mentioned that we're going to be using the Lambda functions here. Let's go ahead and create that folder. So I can go ahead and create a new folder called lambda.fns. And here is where we're going to go ahead and create the different files that we're going to need to handle all of these GraphQL operations. Now, we're going to need to have an index.js. We're going to need to have a post type. And actually, we're going to be using TypeScript, so index.ts. We're going to need a post type. We're going to have a database configuration that we can then just import wherever we like. We're going to need to have a file for create post, update post, and delete post. We're also going to need to have a file for list posts and get post by ID. And I think that is it. We're also going to need to have something installed, or a couple of things installed really. So we're going to go ahead and initialize a package.json. So we should see that we have now package.json there. And what we're going to do is install UUID. And then we're going to be installing this other package called Data API Client. And this is a nice way to interface with the serverless Aurora database using the Data API. So using the Data API, it just allows you to easily connect from a serverless function to the serverless Aurora cluster. So with all of that there, let's go back into our project and open up our Lambda functions. So the first thing we might do is go ahead and create our post type. And this is going to look very similar to our GraphQL operation. So we'll have the ID as a string, we'll have the title as a string, and we'll have the content as a string. And then we'll just say export default post. And now we can use this post anywhere we'd like. The next thing we might want to do is create our database interface. So for that, we're going to be using this Data API client. And here we can now set the secret ARN, the resource ARN, and the database name. Now what we can basically do is use this to query our database by calling things like database.query and passing in our query. The next thing we might do is go into our index file. And this is going to be where, oops, go ahead and save that. This is going to be where we are going to be mapping our GraphQL operations into these different functions. So we haven't yet created the code for create, update, delete, get post by ID, or list posts, but we're going to go ahead and import those here, and we'll create those in just a moment. We also have this AppSync event, and the AppSync event is going to have an info object. It's going to have some arguments. In the info object, the only thing we're going to be working with is the field name, and the field name is going to be something like create, list, update posts, things like that. So the field name is going to be actually, this field name here. So create, update, delete, that's going to be coming off of the event, so we can kind of use that. For the arguments, the only arguments that we have set up in our schema are going to be the post ID and the post. So those are going to be the two arguments that we take into consideration in this type. Finally, in our handler, we're going to have this event coming through, and we're going to be switching on this field name. So we're going to basically say, if this is create post, then call this function. If it's list post, then call that function. So it's a pretty straightforward way to kind of deal with these GraphQL operations that are coming in. And then we just call await using async await, and then that means these functions need to be asynchronous. So let's go ahead and create those functions now. So something basic might be for our list post function. So let's go ahead and create that now. So I'll go ahead and go to list posts. And this is only, about 13 lines of code. What we basically are going to be now doing is importing this database interface from DB. So let's take another quick look at that. All we're doing is creating an instance of data API client and having it configured. And then what we can then do is call database.query, passing in our SQL query. And all we're basically doing for list posts is we're going to select all from the post table, and this is going to return all of those results. And then there is an array off of this results object called records. So we're just going to say we want those result.records to come back, and that's it. If there's an error, we'll log it out, and then we'll return null. And then we, of course, make this async because we're going to be using await. And then we just export this function as the default export. The next one we're going to do is create the get post by ID. This is a little more complex because we're going to be taking in an argument of post ID. And we can then construct our query. And to do that, we need to have our SQL statement, which in this case is going to be select star from post where ID is equal to post ID. And then we need to map this post ID into that operation. And the way that you do that using Data API Client is you create the first argument as the query and the second argument as the variables. So this is our query, and we now need to set post ID. So what we do is we take the post ID from the arguments, and we pass in an object with the post ID. Now this is going to return an array, but in our database, we're only going to be using unique records for each item. So we can be assured that if there is a result, then we want the first item in that array, which is going to be the only item there. So we're saying result.records 0 index. The next operation we're going to be doing is create post. And this is going to be taking in a post as an argument. So we're importing the post from post, the post type. We're importing our DB. We're using this UUID library to create a unique identifier. We then, in our function, are going to check, did the user pass in an ID? If they did, we're going to just use that. If they did not, we're going to create a new UUID and attach it to the post, which will then, at this point, we will then have an ID, a title, and a content field. We then create a similar query as we did in the get post by ID, where we're basically passing in variables, but in this case, we're passing in multiple variables. So we're basically saying insert into posts these three values, ID, title, and content, and then these values, ID, title, and content, passing in the variables as a second argument of this object. So that's create post. The next operation we're going to be doing is delete post, which is pretty basic. We're going to basically say delete from post where the ID is equal to the post ID. The post ID is coming in as an argument here. We then say if the number of records is equal to 1, then return the post ID. If not, return null. Basically, we don't want this to error out if there are no items from the database that match this. So if there are none, we will return null, knowing that there's nothing there. If there is an item that has been deleted, we'll return that post ID. That way we can do some validation from wherever we're calling this API. And then the last function is going to be the update post. This one's a little more complicated because these are our imports, same stuff as before, the post type and the database. But with update, we don't really know how many items are going to be updated, right? Because the post type could maybe have 10 fields or 100 fields or 3 fields like in our case. But we want to create some logic that basically is going to say, okay, look, if there are 5 variables, 2 variables, 10 variables passed in, we want to construct a query based on those variables. And we want it to work regardless. And we don't want to have a separate operation for each individual circumstance. So this code here is going to map over the items in the object, basically turning it into an array, calling objects.entries. We're going to basically say, okay, if this is the ID, then don't do anything, because we don't want to do anything. We already have the ID set here as part of the variables, and we're also going to make sure that we use that ID to specify which item is getting updated right here, where we're basically saying where the ID is equal to ID. And then we're going to map over all of the items in the array, and we're going to construct a query based on those items, and we're going to continue building the query using these 4 lines of code here. After we've mapped over all of the items, we'll then append where the ID is equal to ID, and that's kind of how this works. So I'm linking to all this code, so if this is a little complex, definitely take a look at it, but this is pretty good abstraction for an unknown situation like we're doing here. So I'll go ahead and save that. And we should be ready to test this thing out. So what I want to do is I'm going to go to our CLI and run npm run build. Oops, I need to make sure I'm in the proper directory. And then I'm going to run CDK diff. And then we should see the different resources that would be created if we go ahead and deploy this. So we see a bunch of stuff is being created. That's to be expected, really, because we're creating a bunch of different things having to do with the VPC, as well as our data source, our resolvers, our API, and everything else. So to deploy, we can run CDK deploy. And then what we want to do is we want to map the output file, or the outputs, into a file. So we can say dash uppercase O or dash dash, I think, outputs. But let's say dash uppercase O, and then we can define the location. So for our example, let's go up one directory and put it with our Next.js app. So I'm going to say CDK exports.json. So this is going to deploy our backend. It's also going to create a file that we can then consume in our Next.js app. So while that's deploying, what I'm going to do is go back into our Next app. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and install AWS Amplify. And then we're going to now try to build out some functionality in our app for us to kind of view these posts. And we want to do this using Next.js static site generation props or build steps. So I guess I can go ahead and close our current project because we want to open it back up one level up. And here I should be able to go into pages and see kind of how we have app.js, index.js. So maybe we will, instead of returning just the component in app.js, let's go ahead and create some navigation. And in the nav, what we're going to do is we're going to be using link. And in our nav, we'll have a couple of links, and I'll have to go ahead and look up Next.js link again to make sure I have this right. So let's go ahead and open up this. Okay, so I just need to have like an href. All right, so there's our link to go home. And then we're going to have a link to go to our posts. All right, so that looks pretty good. Now we need to have a page for our posts. So let's go ahead and create a posts.js. And this is going to be kind of like where we query for our post from our API. And I'm going to delete some of this stuff. Just something basic. Because we're going to be doing two things. We're going to be dynamically generating each individual post page based on these posts. And we're also going to be creating a view for us to kind of view all of them and be able to click and kind of navigate to them. So what I'm going to do is we need to have a post array. So what I might do would be to import use effect and use state from React. And then I'm going to go ahead and import API from AWS Amplify. And then I'm going to have const posts, and then update posts is equal to use state, passing in an empty array. And then in use effect, we'll call the API. Okay, so we'll have an async function fetch posts, and then we'll call fetch posts here. This function is going to be calling API.GraphQL, and here we need to pass in a query of some query. So we might call this list posts, and then we need to kind of define that here. And this is something we'll need to define in just a moment. So we have that. We then want to map over these posts. So we might say something like posts.map. Guess we don't really need the index, so let's say post. And here we might want to say link. And this is going to have the post dot title maybe. And then 2 is going to be where we're going to be doing some of our our logic, where we're going to basically be needing to use the post ID. So a URL that might make sense would be posts/ like ID. So let's do something like post.id. And therefore, we need to have a folder in our pages directory that kind of supports this. So let's go ahead and create a folder here called posts and a page here called id.js. All right, so that's kind of how this is going to work. We need to do a few things for this to work. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at how our deployment is going. So our deployment is still in progress. Once this is deployed, we can then kind of go in our API and create some dummy data, but still not done yet. So what I think we should do would be to go ahead and create our code for this component here. So I'm going to go ahead and import API from AWS Amplify again. I'm going to import use router from Next/router. And then I'm going to go ahead and import, let me think what else we're going to need. I guess we're going to need a couple of operations for our GraphQL operations. We haven't really created those yet. But let's go ahead and export our default function of post. This is going to be like an individual post. And this is going to be taken in a post as an argument. And then we're going to go ahead and create a router. And then we're going to be using this idea of a fallback route, meaning that if the route exists, then we're going to render it in this build phase. If it doesn't exist, we want to be able to kind of dynamically generate it. So to do that, we're going to have to see if router.isFallback. And then we're going to return something like this, loading. Now, if it is not a fallback route, then we're going to return, our post information. So for this, we might have something like h1 post.title post.content. So this isn't really a lot of information, but I think the general idea is to kind of understand how all this stuff works. And this is hopefully going to do that without being too verbose and going into too much additional metadata around the post itself. So let's now export our function for get static paths and get static props. And I can actually have some code that we can copy and paste for this. And we'll walk through this. So we basically are going to be using these two functions here, get static paths and get static props. Get static paths, this is basically going to be generating the routes dynamically for us. What we're going to basically be doing is calling api.graphql, passing in the list post query. We're going to then map over these posts, creating a new object that is going to be used for the params, that is going to just hold the ID of the post. And then we return the array of paths here, and then we set the fallback to true, meaning that we're going to build this during the build step, but if someone does happen to land on a new route that has not been generated, then Next.js will generate that route on demand for us. And then we have get static paths, which is basically going to be taking in this ID as a param. So we have this params object, which is going to contain the ID. So we destructure that ID here. We then call the API calling get post. And I think this is going to be called, in our case, get post by ID, but the actual query itself doesn't really matter. We're going to be writing that. We could always just set that as get post. And I think the return value here is going to be postdata.data.getPost by ID or something like that. So with that in place, we have most of what we need. We just need to be able to kind of create our list post and get post queries. So let's go ahead and create that here. So list post is going to be something like query list posts. And here we're going to return the ID, the title, and the content. For get post by ID, let's see if I have a query that we can use. And this is going to be taking in a post ID, and the post ID is going to be a string. And then here we're going to call get post by ID. And here we're going to return the ID, title, and content as well. And I guess really with list posts, the only thing we really need is the ID, because that's all we're kind of asking for here. And then I think we can reuse this list post query and this posts component here. And we're going to need the ID, the title, and the content. Well, actually, we only need the ID and the title, actually. Okay, so we've written our client-side code. Let's jump back. Let's check out our API deployment. It looks like everything is deployed okay. So we've deployed our API, we've deployed our table, and we've deployed our function. But what we basically need to do now is we need to kind of have a way for us to create that table that we're going to need. So to do that, we can basically go ahead in the RDS dashboard, and let's see here, the URL for that. It's going to be something like console.aws.amazon.com/RDS. And then we need to create that post table. So to do that, we can go to Query Editor, and then we can go ahead and sign into our cluster. So I'm going to be using Connect with Secrets Manager ARN, which is good because our CDK stack actually created that ARN for us. So to go there, we can actually just go ahead and go to Secrets Manager, which is console.aws.amazon.com/secrets manager. And then we can just copy this secret ARN, go back here, paste that there, and then the name of the database is blogdb. So doing that, we should be able to go ahead and log into our database. So our database is stood up. It's there. We're going to create a new table called posts. So I'm just going to create this, run the SQL query that says create table posts. ID, that is the type of text that is unique, title of text, and the content of text. So if I run that, we should see that we have successfully created our table. And to test it out, we could do something like, I'll try to zoom in a little bit actually. Select star from posts, something like that. Should return nothing, right? Because we haven't really created anything. But what we should be able to do now is actually, let me open up AppSync in one. And I'm going to keep this RDS open here because maybe we can create an item in our database using AppSync, and then query it using our SQL query. So to run a query, I'm going to go to our backend. I'm going to go to our queries editor, and I'm going to go ahead and run a query. I'll call list posts. This is the same one we're going to be running in our app. And if I run this, it should come empty, right? Because we don't really have any posts. So we'll keep that open. I'm going to go ahead and create a new post. So create post. And this is going to take an input of post. I should be able to leave the ID empty, so I can say title is like hello world, content. And then even though we didn't pass in an ID, since we're auto-generating one, we should be able to kind of do something like that. So there's our post. We should be able to run this query again and see that we have our data in our table. So everything's working. So if we run list post here, we see that we have our posts. So we could also run, our other operations, right? So we have update post. And you can also get to these via the docs here or using the Explorer here. So I could maybe say, delete post, update post, and see all that stuff there. And pass in content title ID. For the ID, I would probably pass in, the ID of one of those posts. And then for the content, I might say something like my updated content. And I might rename this to update post, of course. It looks like I'm trying to return something that I haven't created or that I haven't updated. So let's try that again. And then we do list posts, and we see that we have my updated content. And of course, if we run that query again, we'll see that it's been updated in our database. So our operation seems to be working. Let's now test out our client-side application. But to do that, we need to configure Amplify. But what we have done is when we ran the deployment, we ran this here. So we created this output file. So we should have this CDK exports.json, which we do. And what we basically need to do is configure our Amplify project here and in our Next.js app. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import Amplify from AWS Amplify. I'm going to import the config that we're going to be creating at AWS-exports. And then I'm going to call amplify.configure, passing in the config. So what we basically need to do is create this AWS exports file. And I guess since we're in _app.js, we don't want it to be in pages, so maybe let's bump this up one directory and have it next to our CDK exports. So to make this work, let's go ahead and import this backend stack. So from CDK exports, or CDK actually exports. And we're going to say amplify config is equal to, we're going to be having our key value pairs here. Now, where do we get these key value pairs? Well, if you go to the Amplify docs, you'll see that for the library configuration, we have this section here. And really, you could go to AppSync GraphQL API there and do it as well. But what I'm going to do is search for AppSync, and I'm just going to kind of copy these values here and take whichever ones I need. So I'm going to need the AppSync endpoint, the AppSync API key. Delete some of these comments here. I'm going to need the region, and I think I'm going to need I think I'm going to need all this stuff. Okay, so for the region, I can now use this this value here, project region. So I can say CDK backend stack.project region. For the endpoint, I can say the API URL. For the API key, I can say .api key. And for the authentication type, this is API key. Because if you go to AppSync, you'll see that let's see here. You can see the different configurations for API key as the base type, or IAM, or Cognito user pools. But for us, API key is kind of what we want to use. So now I can go ahead and make this the default export. All right, so we exported that. We should be good to go as far as our configuration is concerned. So I guess the next thing for us to try, and I don't know if this is going to work right because we still need to do some stuff. Oh, it looks like I haven't finished writing my code here. So we need to actually take this post data and kind of like do something with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call update posts, passing in the post data list posts. I think that's what it's going to look like. And maybe I'll console.log this post data. All right, so we have a lot of stuff going on here, so let's test this thing out. I'm going to run npm run dev and see what happens. Localhost 3000, we'll test this thing out. Okay, so our app is running, that's cool. But let's see if we get a post, what happens. Looks like my post link isn't working. I must not have linked that. So let's go to app.js. Oh no, it looks like post is there. Okay, so we have some issues with credentials. So no credentials. So I think maybe what I need to do is in post.js, let's try importing our amplify stuff here. So we're in post, amplify.configure, passing the config. Let's try that. Link is not defined, so let's go ahead and import link from next link. Okay, getting somewhere it looks like. I think I need to maybe, instead of 2, I think this might be href. So let's try that again. All right, there's our our post. So let's go ahead and create another post. So we'll create post number 2. We'll refresh here. We see that we have both posts here. So now, the moment of truth, let's click on this and see what happens. Oh, it looks like we have that same credentials error. So I think what we need to do is kind of, in Next.js, since we're working with SSR and statically generated pages, it might make sense for us to kind of have a configuration that we can just import, right? So I'm going to have a configure amplify.js file here where we kind of do this configuration, and I'll just paste in, all this stuff here. And then what we can do now is anytime we need to configure, we can just import configure amplify. So I'm going to import it there. I'm going to delete this and import it here. And then for this page here, we'll also import it. And I think this needs to even go up one more directory. So we'll try that again. All right, so we getting somewhere. Post data.list post.items. So I don't think we need that items. We just need post data.data.list post.map. We'll refresh that. Let's try that again. Let's go here. Let's go to posts. Getting some error. Okay, so I think the way to debug this would be for us to kind of log some stuff out. So let's log out the post data. Let's log out the paths. And let's see what we got going on here. So the paths have this information here. The post data, that looks fine. So let's now log out this here. And then we're going to remove that. Post ID is null. Okay. So it looks like we're not getting that post ID. Oh, I think I see the problem. We're passing in the ID instead of the post ID. What we basically were trying to do just now is we're taking the ID off of the param, and instead of actually passing in the ID, we needed to pass in the variable called post ID. So now we're passing in the post ID. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, we're still getting this error here, so let's go back again. Get post ID. I wonder if I'm even getting to this point. Yeah, I don't see it. So let me console.log the paths again. So we have the params, post ID. Required parameter ID was not provided. Maybe this has to be the ID. And then what we can then do is ID, post ID is ID. I think that's the problem because our file is called ID, then it's expecting the post ID to be an ID. All right, there we go. So I'll go back to posts. Click on that. We see that that's there. And you might be like, okay, this is kind of slow, right? That's because we're running in dev mode. So let's try to npm run build. And then after this generates, we're going to run npm start, and we'll see a pretty big difference as far as how fast it is. So we'll refresh, and now we're back on the build. So let's go to posts, and we see that when we click on each post, it's a lot faster now because we're running it kind of like in production, you would say. Let's go back and kind of take another look at what happened here. This is kind of like the main mistake I think I've made on this stream. The thing that we are needing is this ID parameter that they're expecting off of the file path, or the path of the URL parameter. So therefore, we need to be passing in that ID as part of the params. So regardless of what we are calling it here, it doesn't really matter. Like, we're calling it post ID, but we still need to be passing it in to the params as an ID. So when this build happens, we call get static paths, and this is like the first function that gets called. We call our API, we get all of our posts. We then map over each post, and we're creating a new object for each item in that array. And that object needs to just have a params property with an object there. And then for the ID, we're setting it as the post ID. We return the paths here. And then for each item in that array, this get static props function gets called. So let's say if there's 2 there, it gets called twice. What we're going to basically be doing there is passing in this object. We're going to get that ID, and then we call another GraphQL operation for this individual post using the post ID that is passed in, as the ID from the params. But since we're using fallback as true, let's see what happens if we tried to go to something that isn't there yet. So let's go to something called like 001. We're not getting anything because we don't have an actual post with that number. But let's say that there was one there, what would happen? Let's try that out. So let's go ahead and create our final post here. We're going to have a post called like my dynamic post. And what we want to do is have a dynamic route essentially. And we're going to pass in an ID, something that we can remember, right? Like 001. And what we want to now do is try to navigate to that route. And we want this to be generated dynamically. So let's try it out. There we go. We see that our fallback route is working, and everything is working as expected. So if you're interested in this type of stuff, if you want to rebuild this app, check out my blog post, Building Real-Time Serverless APIs with Postgres, CDK, TypeScript, and AppSync. Goes through all this here. There's also a link to the reference architecture right here. And this is kind of the app that we built here. The only thing that isn't linked here is going to be the Next app. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to update this repo with the Next app. Not a lot going on there, but still I'm going to link it there because we kind of went over it. That way you have a reference to it. So yeah, that's it for this this stream or this video. I hope you learned something. It was fun building this out. This is becoming my favorite stack, Next.js, Amplify, with some type of like GraphQL backend. So this is really cool stuff. So if you're not already, subscribe to my channel and look out for my next video, hopefully coming soon.